Have you ever wondered why the African tourism market looks underdeveloped yet? Every year, strange numbers are announced about tourists in Africa and how much they spend in Africa. This video will break down what is really going on in the industry as a wake-up call for African tourism regulators. In July 2022, it was reported that the number of tourists that arrived in Africa from overseas added up to around 5.1 million. The report certainly needs adjustments. Firstly, it needs to reflect African tourism, by which we mean Africans going to other African counties. Secondly, it neglects the African diaspora who travel to more African countries and spend more than your average foreigners in Africa. When a Nigerian crosses the border to Benin Republic for tourism, they are also tourists and should be reflected in the numbers. Another example, when a Nigerian with a dual citizenship in America or Europe decides to participate in the popular trend called Dirty December, where they travel to Nigeria for the Christmas holidays, this is also tourism and should be included in the numbers. Quite often these Nigerians pay more for their flights with business or first-class tickets and on average spend between $10,000 to $25,000 during that period. It was also reported that international tourism inbound receipts in Africa amounted to a total of $24.7 billion in 2019, and the average visitor spent $660.70. When you look at even the most mature tourism locations in Africa, they don't look like they made part of $24 billion. Come with us as we explore the real reasons why African tourism is not working for Africa. Have you ever wondered why the African tourism market looks underdeveloped yet? Every year, strange numbers are announced about tourists in Africa and how much they spend in Africa. This video will break down what is really going on in the industry as a wake-up call for African tourism regulators. In July 2022, it was reported that the number of tourists that arrived in Africa from overseas added up to around 5.1 million. The report certainly needs adjustments. Firstly, it needs to reflect African tourism, by which we mean Africans going to other African counties. Secondly, it neglects the African diaspora who travel to more African countries and spend more than your average foreigners in Africa. When a Nigerian crosses the border to Benin Republic for tourism, they are also tourists and should be reflected in the numbers. Another example, when a Nigerian with a dual citizenship in America or Europe decides to participate in the popular trend called Dirty December, where they travel to Nigeria for the Christmas holidays, this is also tourism and should be included in the numbers. Quite often these Nigerians pay more for their flights with business or first-class tickets and on average spend between $10,000 to $25,000 during that period. It was also reported that international tourism inbound receipts in Africa amounted to a total of $24.7 billion in 2019, and the average visitor spent $660.70. When you look at even the most mature tourism locations in Africa, they don't look like they made part of $24 billion. Come with us as we explore the real reasons why African tourism is not working for Africa.
This is what happens from a tourist thinking about traveling to Africa to unpacking after traveling to Africa. Pay close attention to how the money moves to understand why tourism funds don't impact Africa as much as they sound. Booking is probably where the first significant amount of money is spent. Most of these are outside Africa because the entity you pay and the jurisdiction you pay them in are crucial factors here. Even those payments made in Africa have payment service providers outside Africa. This means the payment goes to a foreign entity and not the coffers of the African government. What this means is that the payment is taken on behalf of Africa but does not touch Africa. This should be of concern to African tourism boards because, if I am in Canada and book safari experience in South Africa or Kenya, that physical payment is being taken outside of Africa, in this case, Canada, and not a taxable amount in Africa. The entity that reports that sale is in Canada, not South Africa or Kenya. By way of example, South Africa reported that in 2019, 14.8 million tourists came to its shores and the average spend was $613. This shows the spend excludes their flight ticket or any booking fees. This underscores the fact that the payment is made outside South Africa. The preparation stage naturally is done outside Africa, meaning that money is not spent in Africa. All the money that the tourists spend at their airport and in-flight are all outside Africa and will never touch Africa. The first African money from most tourists will come at the arrival section, where taxes are paid at the airport and transportation services are taken at the airport. Next is destination, and this is a very common trick that most African governments have never really looked into. Firstly, there is a high likelihood that you reserve and book your accommodation at the booking stage, meaning that money, even though for an African property, is taken outside Africa and will not touch Africa. Secondly, what the tourist will spend locally will therefore be food, transportation, and merchandise. By way of example, if my holiday total budget is $10,000, flights may be $4,000 and accommodation may be $3,000, tourism experience is likely to be $2,000. This leaves food and transport with $1,000. Food is not expensive in Africa, and neither is transport and merchandises, and if $600 is spent on this, it is quite generous. In July 2022, according to WEF, the number of tourists that arrived in Africa from overseas added up to around 5.1 million. You will also hear, international tourism inbound receipts in Africa amounted to a total of $24.7 billion in 2019, and the average visitor spent $660.70. What happened to the rest after the $660? The rest is being stolen away from African coffers. This explains why African tourism money has never been able to help in developing Africa. Compare this to tourism in England, where it says England made £100 billion. Almost 99% of that revenue will go through a UK payment gateway, meaning it is recorded as a taxable payment from the UK government's perspective. You can see the difference between the two. It was reported that 5.1 million visitors came to Africa in 2022, and almost $25 billion was spent by the tourists. Several reports into the African tourism, and most of them are very critical. In one of the reports it stated, even price competitiveness, one of the region's strongest advantages, is in some cases diluted by fairly high ticket taxes and airport charges, making air travel more expensive, and hotel prices. These challenges make sub-Saharan Africa less likely to attract visitors and travel and tourism investors, despite its appealing natural assets. Here is our first issue with this statement: it omitted that the ticket fees rarely comes to Africa. Secondly, Sheraton Lagos was the most successful of all the Sheraton hotels worldwide, with 97% occupancy rate at $400 per night. The report does not consider this fact. The report went on to say, this gap is characterized by issues such as unfavorable business environments, health and hygiene concerns, low ICT readiness, and severely underdeveloped infrastructure. In addition, despite the sector's potential and importance to economic development, regional economies are yet to develop strategies to capitalize on this. This is shown in the typically low scores for prioritization of travel and tourism and overall international openness. We believe the report has the following problems. Number 1. The report is written almost entirely from a foreign tourist point of view, with particular focus on a foreign tourist experience in Africa. It needs to include the African experience of tourism in Africa as well. Number 2. One of the first reasons why people want to visit Africa is the Africa safari and, in growing cases, trophy hunting. These reports ignore this sector and hides the fact that payments for trophy hunting are astronomically high and outside Africa. Number 3. Deti December is a major tourist attraction in Lagos that is not comparable to any European tourist experience in Africa. Over 5 million people pay Christmas prices of over $2,000, with an average spending budget of $4,000. This represents $40 billion spent directly with African businesses and services. Number 4. Nigerian events see millions of Nigerians moving from one location to another for entertainment purposes. There are thousands of events in Lagos alone, and in every single weekend and across most of the southern states in Nigeria. Alcohol is consumed at these events. Revenue in the alcoholic drinks market of Nigeria amounts to $34.38 billion in 2023. The market is expected to grow annually by 10.9%. These are factors that should be reflected in African tourism numbers, but perhaps because African tourism boards don't have the technology, they are unable to present their data. Remnants of colonialism, animal conservation, African national parks, Safaris and trophy hunting are all connected in Africa and all the same. You cannot claim you love animal conservation and hate trophy hunting. In Africa, all these exist to the detriment of the African. African countries were forced to adopt animal conservation practices by preserving huge kilometers of land for the sake of reserves, from the colonial era. These animal reserves cover enormous acres of land. A typical example found in the Congo, Virunga National Park, it's approximately 300 kilometers, 190 miles, largely along the international borders with Uganda and Rwanda in the east. It covers an area of 8,090 square kilometers, 3,120 square miles. This is what the African community had to give up in the name of animal conservation. A similar situation can be found across Africa. For the avoidance of doubt, we are not in disagreement with the idea of animal conservation, but we are opposed to the exclusion of African communities from the animal conservation's practices. The African communities need to be the beneficiaries of animal conservation, not victims. At the moment, the animals are treated better than the Africans that own the lands, and that does not make sense. Safaris showcase the very same animals to tourists. An African safari costs anywhere between $125 and $1,500 per person per night. A budget safari averages $150 per night, mid-range $350 and luxury $750. The extreme top safaris can easily go up to $1,500 per night, or more. Trophy hunting can only exist on the foundation set by the animal conservation spaces reserved for animal conservation. They can only shoot the very same animals African communities were forced to give up their lands for, and the very same animals that the safari operators showcase to their clients under the animal conservation banner. They say depending on the country where the hunting is going to take place, the hunting fee ranges from $250 to $1,250 a day. Non-hunting observer ranges from $150 to $450 per day. This is, however, the politically correct figure, and the reality is remarkably different, and why Africans are being taken for fools. Wild lion hunts start around $55,000 and run upwards of $100,000. In Tanzania, a 14-day leopard safaris cost $28,000 to $50,000, and a 21-day hunt with trophy fee costing up to $103,000. Elephant hunts are normally 10 days hunts, and you can expect to pay around $40,000 for your trophy fee, for a big tusker between 40 to 70 pounds. As many of the African tourism market lacks the technology for the industry, then we can assume that no African government knows how many lions and tigers they have. As we highlighted in the booking stage of tourism, if the booking is done in Canada and payment made in Canadian dollars, how will the African governments know?
Without digging too deep, you can see how the African tourism market is in need of a major overhaul and needs to get its affairs in order because it is losing millions of dollars every year. Just on the number of tourists, in 2019, international organizations said there were 5.1 million tourists to the whole of Africa, yet for the same year, South Africa says there were 14.8 million tourists that visited her shores. Why the discrepancy? This shows there are different interpretations of the numbers. This is further compounded by the fact that most of the major tourism operators in Africa have access to foreign countries in terms of visas, whilst most Africans in the same sector are subject to visa restrictions. The descendants of the colonial era can use the fact that their grandparents are from Europe to access Europe and set up companies that take payments for the African tourism market, therefore evading payments to the African governments. The world's worst kept secret is the connection between animal conservation and trophy hunting. What is concerning is the payment system structure is depriving Africa of millions of dollars each year. In conclusion, it is clear to see why tourism is not working for Africa. Its payment system structure is designed to deprive the African tourism market millions per year. There is no doubt for these issues to be addressed, the African tourism market needs to improve its ICT position and become an active participant in producing the reports and not simply a consumer of the reports.